First up this morning, we have a presentation from Robert Triendl. Robert gets a special award for his bio. It says, Robert enjoys all the things that make life worthwhile. In his spare time, he also works for DDN. He didn't really grow up with Lustre, but he seems to be getting old with it. Thank you, Robert Triendl. The title of his talk is Growing Up with Lustre. Ladies and gentlemen, Robert Triendl.
Thank you, Steve. As you will see in a moment, this is not really a typo, but I'm not going to explain that. So this is a marketing presentation. It comes with a dedication to two human beings. So I am grateful for Steve. A couple of years ago we had a discussion and said, I have a sister who lives in Bloomington and I never go to Bloomington, so why don't we have LUG in Bloomington so I can visit my sister? So thank you for that, Steve. Now I also have a niece, Semilia. So we had a conversation about Lustre a couple of weeks ago, which inspired the first half of the presentation. So try to explain Lustre to a 3-year-old, and I was really trying. So it's not human, it's a beast. Now what's a beast? You know, what beast? So I was trying to go back to, high school or, university graduation. So beasts, what beast are you as a human being? So it could be a hedgehog. No. I didn't realize that there are no hedgehogs in the US. Or are there? Or they are imported from Europe, probably. It could be a fox, but I really think it's a hedgehog. You all probably know a fox is a being that knows many things shallowly and does them reasonably well. A hedgehog is a being that knows one thing really, really well. So yes, Lustre does know one thing really, really well. It does fast I/O for a Scratch parallel file system really, really well. GPFS is a bit more of a fox. It does all those other things, has all these other functions that kind of work. A couple of years ago, one of the founding members of OpenSFS, who's not here, who works at Intel and who used to work at Lawrence Livermore, came to us and said, so what would you do with Lustre if you had unlimited resources? So we sent Mark Seeger a list of all the things we wanted to do to make Lustre become more of a fox, or, maybe like a foxhog or something in between, but the being that does one thing very well, but also does a bunch of other things very well. Now, talking to my niece, I realized, hedgehogs usually, they die after 3-4 years. Foxes, usually 5-6 years, maybe in captivity 15 years like a dog. So, Lustre is probably neither. So it's kind of 20 years old. So what kind of beast is it? So mooses get about 25 years. Whales, 35 years. Elephants, 50 years. And of course, I couldn't resist to have a giant tortoise, 125 years. I don't know what it would mean for a piece of software to live for 125 years. I was at a customer Airbus a couple of months ago, and I was told that they were searching on the internet for a VAX system to run software that does cabling. And cabling inside the aircraft, and I was also told that the Airbus 380 was late because it used more modern cabling software that was developed in Germany rather than the old cabling software that runs on a VAX that was developed by a cabling engineer. So it's going to be interesting to see, give or take 100 years, what will be left of Lustre. I'm not implying here that Lustre is heavy and slow, and it certainly isn't. So again, it's a beast. Then sort of software. Now, what is software? Explain software to a 3-year-old, or explain open source to a 3-year-old. Sort of reflecting the open source. What does that mean? There are many definitions of open source, by the way, as we in this community all know. There is the Canadian definition. There is the Danish definition. That's a special one. And there are also all sorts of other definitions. There's the Chinese definition, which is software. Why do you need the word open? It's source. So anyway, I just sort of wanted to share some of my pains of explaining a parallel file system to a 3-year-old. And now I get back to my marketing presentation. So why a DDN? Why do we still do Lustre? There's one simple reason. It's really the only viable open source parallel file system that offers globally consistent POSIX namespace. There really isn't any other viable solution today. And it is developed and maintained by a small but fairly resilient user-developer community that is also resilient to all sorts of corporate politics. So we have worked with the Lustre team when it was CFS. We have worked with the Lustre team when it was Sun. We have worked with the Lustre team when it was Oracle. We have worked with the Lustre team when it was VMcloud. We have worked with the Lustre team when it was Intel. We will work with the Lustre team when it will be whatever, because we work with the Lustre team and not with a corporation. The focus of Lustre, of course, is on traditional HPC, tightly coupled simulations that use MPI, but the reality is that the user base is increasingly diverse, and most of what we do in Lustre today is really users that have lots of data as opposed to users that run very large simulations. And I've reflected a lot on that, so we talk about enterprise features when what does enterprise really mean? There are like 1,000 different meanings for that. We talk about appliances, but Lustre really isn't an appliance, and anytime you try to package it in an appliance, you will fail dismally because it is a difficult piece of software, and you better let the user know that it's difficult. But that is also an advantage to it, and it isn't controlled by any single vendor. And I think the fact that this community exists testifies to that. Now more marketing. So I said growing up with Lustre DDN, the first system that was Lustre that we delivered, and we hadn't anything to do with Lustre except with the hardware, was give or take 15 years ago at NCSA. And then a couple of years later, we decided to do something called packaging and do a bit stuff around without really doing anything with the file system. So we launched a product called Exascaler, which was just Lustre with a bit of wrapping around, a few Python scripts. But over time, this really did venture into something different. And I will describe that in a moment. So a piece of software that has a very diverse user basis. Our largest Lustre user today is a corporation that has 350 OSSs in production on 100, give or take, 175 storage systems with a 30-minute SLA and give or take 150 petabytes of data. And that's just one user, and surely there is no tightly coupled MPI simulation whatsoever. It's a machine learning application that runs in that environment. And we increasingly sort of have a broad portfolio of products. So we have started to support Lustre as such as software rather than an appliance or hardware plus software. We do sell the so-called appliances, which is just a bit of packaging. And we have started a little practice around CFS recently. So in the end, sort of what you get with this is a Lustre distribution that is within sort of the overall tree. So it's not forked in any way, it's hardened a bit. So we typically spend 3 to 6 months of testing before of any release. There is sort of the old issue with high availability that hasn't ever been fixed within the file system. Why, I'm not entirely sure. So you do it with tools around the file system. There are this or that feature that a customer has requested and that we have built. There is a set of tools, there is monitoring, all those things that sort of we do today, and there is support from level 1 to level 3. As I said, with some customers that have SLAs that are measured in 15 to 30 minutes. And the work that goes into this distribution, so there's a small development team that has produced around 250,000 lines of code in the last couple of years. Most of it, as you can see here, I've just listed most of the projects in terms of lines of code, most of it around an automated test infrastructure that took a couple of years to build. But that really is sort of the core component of supporting a Lustre distribution. And there will be, I think, a couple of presentations during LUG that will go into the details of some of these projects. So I will not do that. I do want to talk a bit about sort of future. So how will future architectures look like? Are we still going to use Lustre, yes or no? So yes, there still will be a Lustre file system in future connected to a compute cluster, but increasingly we will put a layer in between that is an I/O forwarding layer or caching layer which is the IME layer that emulates the Lustre namespace. So it's not a separate namespace, it just takes the metadata space. So it's a sophisticated way of I/O forwarding with caching and high availability. Eventually we want to bring that to the client so that you can use devices on a client for caching. And all that still exists within a POSIX namespace. Of course, a future iteration of the same architecture, potentially running in the same cluster, will then also provide an object namespace for applications that can make use of that object namespace. And that object namespace eventually may have a Lustre backend, but it will also provide new capabilities. So for large systems, I think this is give or take the architecture that we see going forward. And of course, we will try to integrate the Lustre piece, which provides the global POSIX namespace, and sort of the cache piece in an increasingly sort of more sophisticated and more intelligent way. Obviously, you create data tiers here, so it's important that there is intelligent software that manages where the data resides. So I did search a lot about sort of animals and how old they get. So baboons are like 35 years. The rhinoceros was about 40 years. It's about double. So what's the next 20 years for Lustre, the way we see it as a company? So globally consistent POSIX namespaces will be around for a long time. They will be around simply because of the application lifetime. And as I mentioned earlier, companies look for very old computing devices just to be able to run pieces of software. So there will be globally consistent POSIX namespaces even in 20 years, I'm pretty sure. Which is why Lustre will still be around in 20 years. But I do think that the focus in development will also change. This is just a prediction at the personal level. So yes, there will need to be more focus on data management rather than pure performance. I think that's almost self-evident. And of course, more focus on the usual management, usability, logging, etc. All those things that make an infrastructure a bit easier to use. And it will remain a community-driven open source effort that isn't owned by any single company, which is why it will survive the next 20 years. Thank you. Any questions? If not, then I think we can proceed to the important part of the day.